morning, everyone, and welcome to the next in our series of Carbon via COP26 webinars. We've had a lot of interesting discussion so far on sort of the introduction to the climate emergency and also planning for 15-minute cities and behaviour change, and the importance of encouraging behaviour change associated with these ideas has been really central to a lot of those discussions. So we wanted to extend that and have a separate session on the behaviour change that might be required in order to support the road to net zero. So we've got an excellent panel of speakers today to take you through a few of these ideas. We're going to kick off with a presentation from Professor Peter Newell, who's at the Rapid Transit Alliance, followed by a Q&A with him, and then there will be a series of short talks from our other speakers, Steve Mellier, Trevor Ellis, Deborah Fox and Mike Scott, and we'll have time for Q&A with all of those speakers after that as well. So looking forward to a very interactive and interesting session. As usual, please put your questions in the chat box and I will do my best to field them to all of our speakers. Particularly starting off with Professor Peter Newell, who'll have his Q&A after his presentation. As usual, everything is going to be recorded and available to all attendees afterwards on the YouTube channel and other social media platforms from Landor, and we'll also get a copy of the slides. I'd also like to point out that we've got a handouts section as well in your dashboard. You should be able to see materials associated with this, and we'll be adding other background reading to that as well, so you should be able to access those handouts. So without further ado, I'd like to move on and introduce Professor Peter Newell, who will take us through his thoughts on changing our ways. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks very much, Katie, and thanks to Juliana and colleagues for the invitation to speak today. Basically, what I'd like to do with you in the few minutes I have is share with you a few insights from the work of the Cambridge Sustainability Commission on Scaling Behaviour Change, which launched our report earlier this year, back in April, a report I wrote with my colleagues at Statistics, Freddie Daly and Michelle Twenner. And what I'll try and do is relate some of the key insights and key messages to the transport sector, though it should be noted that I'm not a specialist in transport. Energy is more my area, but of course the two things are related. Next slide, please. So just firstly, by way of background, it's increasingly clear that alongside shifts in policy, service provision and technological innovation, far-reaching changes are required in lifestyles if we're to avoid more dangerous levels of global heating. So after this quite long period of neglect in many ways, sustainable behaviour change is now rising up the climate policy agenda. And I think we can see that in the last IPCC report, which devotes attention to this. There was also a chapter in the UNEP emissions gap report saying far more about the role of behaviour change in reaching ambitious climate goals. And of course, governments increasingly view it as an important element of their own climate change strategies. Nevertheless, scaling and maintaining sustainable behaviour change at the level and speed now required represents, we argue in this report, a different order of challenge for those seeking to advance climate action change, as you can see from some of the figures on this slide. Next slide, please. So one of the things we address in the report, and one of our sort of points of departure, if you like, is that dominant approaches to scaling behaviour change are not working as they need to. They often emphasize just numbers of people adopting behaviors in quite a generic and socially undifferentiated way. And often this serves to decontextualize the nature of the change, and it obscures rather than clarifies where predominant responsibility and agency lies for taking action, as well as overlooks some of the important contextual differences in what works and where. So in the context of climate change, immediate challenges for behaviour change are, firstly, we argue, reducing the lifestyle emissions of the polluter elite. And this is an idea that comes from the work of Dario Kenna, who wrote an excellent book on carbon inequality. And he talks about different dimensions of the polluter elite. But the dimension that's relevant for our discussion today is that the lifestyle emissions, the carbon footprint, if you like, of the richest 1% or 5% or 10%, depending on how you define the nature of that polluter elite. So it's not a generic challenge. It really is about containing and reversing some of the highest, most carbon intensive impacts of the richest members of society, and trying to think about the sort of policy strategies and interventions that will allow us to do that. But it also means not just talking about lifestyles in general, but focusing on what we call hotspots, and other researchers have used that language as well. And that really refers to things like aviation, it's food, it's housing. And so I guess in the context of transport, aviation would be the one that would stand out as the sort of the key transport related hotspot. Next slide. So just transitions. As these figures on this slide show, any attempt to transform behaviours has to start with a recognition of the glaring inequalities between rich and poor in society in relation to their levels of consumption. And that to be effective and socially accepted, shifts in behaviour need to address social and economic justice, and at the very least, not entrench existing inequalities. And of course, that's one of the key concerns for BEIS and other government agencies around how do you make sure that the drive towards a low carbon economy is also attentive to issues and questions of social inclusion. So placing economic justice at the heart of efforts to scale behaviour change has the advantage, we argue, of reducing inequality between this polluter elite that I was referring to and the poorest groups in society, who of course often lack access to affordable energy, housing, transport and food. And so key intervention points lie in trying to create enabling environments that facilitate, incentivise and lock in more sustainable behaviours among this broader section of society. So it might be low cost electric vehicle bus provision, for example, properly insulated homes to address questions of energy poverty and to reduce emissions. Next slide, please. So the thing we put accent on in the report is this link between individual and system change. As many of you probably know, in previous discussions of behaviour change, you often get this polarisation between those who say it's all about individuals and households and nudging them to do the right thing on the one hand, or others who say that's a waste of time, it's all about system change. What we try to do here is talk about these ecosystems of transformation, that really it's about the link between those two things. We need to go beyond this unhelpful binary of it's either individual or it's system change. Clearly it's both. The question is, how do we link the two in more productive and creative ways? And really that means going beyond just thinking about how do we persuade or nudge individuals and households to do things differently, but to think about the roles all of us occupy, not just in the home through our purchasing choices, but in the workplace, in the broader community, in broader public life. There's lots of spheres where we have different levels of influence and control over consumption choices, and we need to think much more creatively, I think, about those multiple roles and how we can rewire them towards more sustainable change. Next slide, please. So really what this leads to in terms of bringing in this more structural element is getting to the roots of the problem. And I've sort of pointed out here on this slide several ways of approaching this in relation to transport. But basically the top line message here is that we really have no chance of reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement on climate change with current approaches to behaviour change, which are about nudging, individualising responsibility, if we leave the drivers of unsustainable consumption intact. And so we need to socialise the idea and raise the importance of ideas of limits, including limits on supply. So in the bigger climate change context, there's big drives towards fair international legal instruments to leave fossil fuels in the ground, so-called supply side policies. But it's also about supply of unsustainable forms of transportation and what we can do to regulate those, the design and innovation around SUVs or private jets or whatever it might be. So it has to be about this, some sort of notion of limits and planetary boundaries has to inform our discussions about the parameters of what needs to change and who needs to change. So this isn't limits on the imagination about how we get there, it's about being liberal with our politics, but not liberal with limits. And we argue really that parameters need to be set to enable society to live within some of these key thresholds. And this invites an emphasis on what we refer to as shrink and share. And so one concrete manifestation of this, many of you are probably aware of it, the way in which the city of Amsterdam has embraced this idea of donut economics, first developed by Kate Rayworth, and trying to apply it to their urban planning models. And so it requires a shift of thinking from just like more efficient production and consumption to embracing far more seriously ideas about sufficiency. But it also requires a more, and this is a more challenging area perhaps, a more sophisticated understanding of the social and cultural drivers of overconsumption. addressing advertising, fossil fuel advertising, and the media's role in the normalisation and reification of high consumption living and behaviours, including, of course, around transport. Next slide. So one of the things we emphasise is what we call choice editing. A lot of work in behaviour change uses this phrase, and it's really about trying to restrict unsustainable technologies, vehicles, ways of producing and consuming things coming to market in the first place. Because once they are there and people get used to them and they get attached to them and we build infrastructures around them, it's really hard to undo that. So this is what we mean by choice editing, making the tough choices about restricting high carbon intensive products and services coming on stream in the first place. And it means going beyond what we also refer to as plug and play. This isn't just about plugging in EV vehicles in place of petrol cars. It's about rethinking mobility. Can we reduce the amount we need to travel in the first place? And some of that's through planning, some of it through things like home working, as we're seeing now in response to COVID, a whole range of more creative ways of rethinking mobility rather than just plugging in a new technology or a new transport solution without thinking more broadly about how to reduce demand. Next slide, please. So one of the things we need to do, of course, is involve people. If we're going to have a just transition, if we're going to socialise the idea about limits and so on, we need to bring people into politics and the design of transport policy and approaches to sustainability more broadly. And we've seen, of course, a lot of innovation around this in the UK and in France, the use of climate assemblies, trying to bring citizen voices into this and to avoid some of the problems where things go wrong. We've seen this, of course, in low traffic neighbourhoods in London, a certain amount of resistance and a rejection of these things when they're seen as being top down. I know there's some discussion here where I live near Brighton about efforts to try and get cars out of the city centre and whether this is realistic and whether it's discriminating against poorer vehicle users, etc. These debates, as we all know, are very live, and I think one of the key ways of getting around those and dealing with them properly is involving people in some of the difficult trade-offs and allowing them almost to act as decision makers in thinking through viable options moving forward. And so finally, next slide, please. I just want to emphasize the importance of imagination in all of this. Often I think we have a failure of imagination. We tend to think in terms of the very immediate and the here and now. And yet, partly through the processes I was just describing, we do need to try and reimagine urban space and transport and housing in more creative ways. And setting limits, although it's often seen as a constraining thing, I think it can also be an empowering thing. Hence the phrase, necessity being the mother of all invention. And I quite like this phrase that I've got on the slide there from Rob Hopkins, who was involved in setting up the transition town movement, as you probably know. He's got this great book called From What Is to What If, and it's about how can we get people to think beyond the here and now and the current ways in which we organise transport systems in this case, to think about, well, what if they were organised differently around people's needs, around prioritising clean air, about prioritising the needs of poorer groups in society. So just trying to really think through and unleash the imagination about how we want to get about in a more sustainable way and getting people involved in that process. So I'll stop there because I think my time is probably up. Just this final slide, so next slide please. You'll see a list of all the resources coming out of this work, and basically just a word on the Commission. We had 31 members from different disciplines in different parts of the world. We tried to pull together the sort of state-of-the-art evidence on the scaling of behaviour change and come up with various recommendations. So you'll see through those links, there's a shorter policy briefing, there's the executive summary, there's recommendations for funders, because this was supported by a foundation, and then the main body of the report itself. So happy reading, and thanks for listening.
Peter, thanks very much for kicking us off there. It was a good start to things, and I've got already a few questions for you. And if others on the in the audience do, please use the question function to add those in. Before we get into some of the sort of the positive changes and things, I want to, I guess, get a sense of where you think we are now. I think there's a recognition that perhaps we're not doing enough, but how far do you think the sort of current approaches would take us in terms of the road to net zero, if we didn't sort of change our ways any further than what we're already doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things at the moment, I mean, I see certain signs of progress. I mean, the drive towards electric vehicles, notwithstanding what I said about going beyond that. But if you'd asked me sort of, 5-6 years ago, could I imagine this government going for the phase out of the internal combustion engine, I'd have probably laughed and thought that was inconceivable. So the fact we've got a sort of tough deadline on that, I think, is really impressive. And clearly there's a lot of progress across a number of fronts. One of the key challenges, of course, is that we see just as many counter instruments. So, until very recently, of course, UK government money was being used on supporting fossil fuel finance overseas, for example, and there was a big campaign on that, and there's been pressure on that. But we still have the Oil and Gas Authority, which is driving it to maximum recovery of resources. And as you probably know, there's a judicial review by the NGO Uplift at the moment, contesting some of the economic basis of that and how those calculations are made. Globally, we have $100 million a minute still going towards fossil fuel subsidies. So it's a give and take. There are some signs of progress. There's some really important things going on. And of course, some of this won't be news to anyone on this call, is about different government departments having different priorities. So you might have quite ambitious things coming out of environmental ministries around the world, but then you have finance ministries trumping that or raising concerns about feed-in tariffs for support to energy, or economic impacts of pedestrianisation, or whatever it might be. So you get this mixed picture, and really then it's about the power relations between those different actors. And I guess that's partly why we emphasise this question of a power shift. And I've just written a book about that more broadly, because it really is important to sort of rewire politics in terms of who gets represented in the key decisions around a low carbon economy, or even around transport policy. At the moment, there's a lot of lobbying from the beneficiaries of the status quo, through party donations, through access to committees, through revolving doors, all of these sorts of things. And so if we're really serious about making sure that some of the beneficiaries of the shift to a lower carbon economy, as well as some of those who are most affected, and of course here I mean younger people, then we need to sort of rethink institutional and governance mechanisms. And so some parliaments around the world, this is true in Wales, Hungary, Israel, have an ombudsperson for future generations, so they're actually part of the process. In this country, of course, we've got the Climate Change Committee, and I think they play a really important role in having an independent oversight of carbon budgets and pressuring governments. But I think it does really mean rewiring a little bit the political system so it's fit for purpose. Otherwise it can get, I don't want to say corrupted by, but it's heavily influenced by actors that have no interest in driving this forward and in dragging their feet for as long as possible. So this is why we bring in the governance and political dimensions. Otherwise you will keep getting these contradictions that I've been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the Committee for Climate Change there. Obviously, a couple of audience members have pointed out the report that's just come out today, and the view that that we're way off in terms of the sort of government actually putting their ambitions into practice. So, what's your view on that in terms of how far away we are, and whether there will be any further movement, I suppose, there.
I think there'll have to be, and of course it's a good moment to be putting pressure on the UK government to go further in the year of hosting the COP.
Yes.
And we've seen this around things like fossil fuel finance, and we've seen it around the Cumbria coal mine proposal that was then sort of shelved. I mean, of course, it doesn't mean it's killed off for good. There may still be some movement around that, but it's a good moment to shine the spotlight on what we're doing in this country and trying to sort of raise ambition. But clearly, I mean, I guess this goes back to the polluter elite point that I was referring to. There's still some work to do in making the really bold and tough decisions around airport expansion, or around HS2, or these sorts of things, and actually taking on some of the more powerful industries as well as consumers, individual consumers. And this is the polluter elite question. And I don't see so much movement there. There have been many proposals about frequent flyer levies, things like this. I saw Ed Miliband was being interviewed about that on Radio 4 this morning. So I've not seen the details of the report, but he was being interviewed about some of it, and he was expressing support for that. But I suspect there'll be huge objections to that amongst the Conservative Party and across government. And this is where I come back to this thing about being liberal in our politics, but not being liberal about limits. You know, it's not okay for certain parts of the population, you know, within this country and globally, to blow the carbon budget. So what are the mechanisms for, if people won't show self-restraint, what do we need to do then to respect carbon budgets? Is it about carbon rationing? Is it about taxes and levies and these sorts of things? That's all, you know, helpful. But as I was trying to also suggest, I think going forward in terms of innovation and technologies coming to market, let's try and stop some of the super high carbon intensive things coming into the marketplace in the first place. Because it's, you know, again, if you expand an airport, it's going to fill to capacity. You're going to get more planes in the air. You've got a problem. How do you then persuade people to not fly? Well, it's a whole lot easier to not expand airports and to provide alternatives in terms of high-speed rail and other things is a far more preferable solution. Likewise, trying to sort of tax people out of their SUVs or keep them out of city centres is fine, but it's a whole lot easier if you sort of say to car makers, cars of a certain engine size just can't be made in the future unless they're EV, etc., etc. Likewise, housing, you know, it's really about just designing proper, decent insulation standards, making sure they've got solar PV, making sure there's charging points nearby. A lot of this is based, you know, key urban planning issues, and I know a lot of people on the call are from local authorities, and I realise how cash strapped they are and how difficult it is for them to make some of these choices. So they need that supportive, enabling environment for government to sort of show that government's on side. Government can't just pass down all these really tricky choices to local authorities, when often also they don't have huge amounts of control. There's some things they do have control over, and transport is perhaps one of them more than energy. But even housing stock is often, you know, privatised. There are things they can do around procurement through schools and hospitals and things, but you know, their decision-making autonomy is also quite constrained. And of course, you know, there's very difficult questions around budgets and whether they've got the funds to do these sorts of things. So you know, yes, there's far more that can be done, but we definitely need to raise the level of ambition. But now's a good time to try and do that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Certainly, as you say, it's focusing the mind a little bit at the moment, certainly, and also you talked about the importance of involving people, and obviously part of that behaviour change, but actually in the co-creation and the sort of the engagement and the inclusive policy. Are there good examples of that you've seen that have worked elsewhere or here in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, more and more people are reflecting on the experience of climate assemblies that have been undertaken so far in various parts of the country, and I've been involved in the process here locally, and it is very difficult. There's no question that it's a sort of panacea and it sort of solves everything, because there's always questions about, you know, which experts are invited to give evidence about different options, which groups are represented, and I think, you know, it needs to be transparent who's selected and how. Otherwise, you will get backlash from certain groups that feel they've not been included and these solutions have been imposed. But I've been quite encouraged by some of the findings and the proposals that groups have come up with. And having heard the evidence, having debated the options, having thought about the trade-offs, they've come up with quite bold and progressive things. So I take heart from that. I see that as a good thing and a positive thing, and it gives governments a mandate to go further. I mean, the academic Rebecca Willis, I don't know if you've seen some of her work, but she's been talking to a lot of politicians about why they don't go further on climate change, why they're not more ambitious and bolder in their interventions. And a lot of it came down to the fact that people are fearful. They feel like they're not carrying the public with them, that they haven't got a mandate to do that. And so the more you can involve people in those decision-making processes which affirm the fact that, yes, they do want governments to go further, and they're aware of how tricky this is, and there are some trade-offs, and there will be some adjustments and restructuring, but they're nevertheless in favour of it. That gives, you know, both local officials, but also national level politicians, a mandate to be bolder and go further. So I think, you know, those sorts of processes are really valuable and really important.
Definitely, and we've seen quite a lot on sort of national campaigns and things like that as well. Do you feel that any of those behaviour change campaigns or sort of positive advertising have actually had any impact? Do you think that's are they working?
Yeah, I mean, the conversation about so-called bad advertising is certainly getting some traction now, and of course it's focused a little bit on the Euros, the football. So when we're watching England-Germany next week, you might see still in the background, there'll be like Qatar Airways, Gazprom advertising their wares. And so my colleague Andrew Sims and others have been doing quite a lot of work raising those questions about sponsorship and fossil fuel advertising and so on. So some of those campaigns are starting to ask those questions about, particularly because of the impacts of climate change on sports and sporting infrastructures and the ability to conduct games. So some of those sort of campaigns that are asking critical questions that have not really been asked so far, I think are really useful in forcing the conversation. So, I mean, that's partly on behaviour change, but because it's encouraging fans and others to put pressure on their clubs and think about transport infrastructures for getting to football games, but it's also asking those more difficult questions around advertising. I mean, I think we're seeing, obviously, there's long histories of trying around plastic bags and recycling and all those sorts of things around behaviour change. I think the key thing now, I guess, is in the post-COVID moment, how do we make public transport appealing again? Because just as we were starting to get people out of their cars a bit more and think more seriously about, getting people onto public transport, then COVID struck, and of course people are more paranoid about travelling on public transport. So that's going to be a key battle, showing that that's safe, making it more affordable, frankly, as well. Because people are, have taken an economic hit, and if prices are not managed, it's going to be very difficult to persuade people back on public transport. So there's going to have to be some effective sort of campaigning and targeted interventions around that. But I think it's also a question of locking in the positives that happen, the rise in cycling and walking and those sorts of things. So, pedestrianisation, car-free cities, proper cycle lanes, all of those sorts of things, I think will become more popular, as well as just reducing commuting through home working. So I think it's that sort of joined up picture, and I think there's a lot of work that can be done there to support sort of positive behaviour change in that direction.
Yeah, certainly it's something that the industry is grappling with now. What are the long-term impacts on transport behaviour of COVID, and how much of that will stick? As you say, locking in the benefits is so key. I'm sure we'll come on to discuss that a little bit more later on as well. And we've probably got time for just a couple more questions as well. So it's been really interesting. There's a lot of ground covered here. Just picking out into something interesting from one of the audience members is around whether you feel that the government is perhaps using innovation and sort of technology fixes as a way out of sort of addressing core issues here. And one of the examples used is apparently George Eustace recently challenged on reducing meat consumption, and he sort of answered by pointing out that animal feed additives were being added to reduce methane emissions. So are we not tackling the core problem? Are we, what role does technology play in that sense?
Well, I mean, technology is going to be crucial. Technology innovation are vital, but it's absolutely true. The issue that the questioner raises, that people are looking, they're desperate for techno fixes that don't require us to change behaviours and that don't require us to shift priorities or to produce and consume differently. If you think of Bill Gates' latest book and many others sort of saying, either it's some mix of geoengineering or some technological wizardry that's going to decarbonise steel or cement or some of the sort of really hard to shift sectors. It's great that some people are putting money into that and going for those sorts of interventions and mobilising private capital. But the reason we have a climate crisis is not for the lack of technology, and it's not for the lack of finance, much as we might want to redirect money in the ways I was describing, i.e. away from fossil fuel subsidies and things like that and towards lower carbon alternatives. It's not for the lack of good technology that we have a climate crisis. It's that we've got this level of lock-in and a lot of very powerful interests that want to extract every last bit of coal, oil and gas from the ground and make huge amounts of money from it. So it's a deeper question, and it's around production and consumption and behaviour and all of those sorts of things. And the problem with some of those technological fantasies, if you like, is that they do imagine that there's a world without limits. It's just about, unleashing more and more innovation, and somehow this is going to solve the problem. But we do need to produce and consume less and very differently, and that's not a popular message. And so the default option is often to say what I was referring to as plug and play, just plug in a different set of energy sources or transport options, and everything else can stay the same. We don't need to rethink demand. We don't need to rethink mobility. We don't need to think about how we work. Well, actually, we do. Would be my view. So technology, of course, is part of the picture, but it can't be the only strategy. Otherwise, there's just no way that we can get towards the sort of Paris goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And you picked up on a theme that's come through in some of the other comments as well, in that we seem to be caught in this continual battle between sustainability and the economy, and often the economic arguments sort of win out. So, how do we, what's the solution to that? And indeed, are there sort of economic benefits to these climate change sort of messages that we're promoting?
Definitely. I think sort of starting with the co-benefits thing is huge. So it's not about taking away people's rights to mobility, but it is saying that the rights to clean air of our children outside schools trump the rights of SUV drivers to leave their cars running outside. So I think that and that's partly why we're saying the social justice element is absolutely crucial. So for the polluter elite, it does have to be about restraining. There may be some more punitive policy tools that have to be used, but for the bulk of us, we don't have a lot of choice really about how you heat your home and how you get to work and these sorts of things. It has to be about the positive enabling infrastructures. And it doesn't really matter whether people are prioritising climate change, but they do prioritise normally the amount of money they spend on their energy bills or how much money they have to spend to get to work. So make it easy. If the options can be lower carbon and more affordable, those are your entry points. So it will often be about health and well-being, or spending more time with family if it's around home working, whatever it might be. There are numerous co-benefits, but also let's be clear about the costs of business as usual, because that often doesn't get talked about and say, oh, but the costs of subsidies to renewable energy or the costs of trying to go for electrification are just too high. Well, the economic and human and other impacts of climate change and of carrying on this path are just huge. And of course, they often don't hit those of us in the richer part of the world first or hardest. So it raises all those sorts of social justice questions. But the massive costs on all of our, on our health, on our well-being, on future generations, on other countries of the current way of doing things are vast. So let's have that conversation when we're talking about costs as well. So the unaffordable and unsustainable cost of the current way of doing things, plus the huge benefits of going down, a more sustainable pathway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's all about, as you say, how that is framed and how we can demonstrate that to sort of a level of understanding that will encourage the behaviour change. So that's been a really fascinating discussion. There's quite a few comments and things. If we can't get to them all, we will try and pick those up at a later date. But I would encourage everybody to have a look at Peter's work and the resources that he's linked to as well. And I think we shall have to move on to our other speakers. But thank you very much, Peter, for your contributions this morning.
Yeah, well, thank you for chairing and inviting me.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
So, as I said, lots to think about there, certainly, and it gives us a good sort of platform. And now I'd like to invite our next sort of panel of speakers to run us through some of the other areas that they're going to be talking about, particularly in relation to transport and what we can do to encourage behaviour change. And as you can see, Steve's here ready to get started on that. So I'll pass straight over to Steve. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to use to advance the slides. First thing, I think, as Peter has already kind of alluded to, let's be very clear. We are not on course. There's been plenty of talk, plenty of change of thinking, plenty of plans and targets, but the situation that we face right now is global emissions are still rising. We are heading for those tipping points very rapidly, as the IPCC is about to confirm in a leaked report. Here in the UK, our emissions have been going down, but not fast enough. And the worst sector, which now dominates the output, is transport. Now, very recently, and of course this has not been given the publicity that it really deserved, is the passage into law of the 6th carbon budget is going to be a real game changer. You can see there where we are and where we legally now have to get to. there are many reasons for that failure. A lot of them are political. I think a lot of them you can see captured in this diagram, and particularly focus on the bottom one, tax on petrol. Governments have become addicted to cutting tax on petrol. Unfortunately, the media present this in a highly misleading way that talks about freezes. These are not freezes, they are cuts. The tax on petrol is now a third lower than it was in the year 2000 after the fuel tax protest, at the same time as public transport fares have been rising much more rapidly than inflation. And those people who had kind of hoped that somehow COVID was going to save us, that flexible working from home was going to sort of institute some new era of sustainability. You know, as I've been consistently writing throughout the pandemic, there never was any reason for believing any of that guff. We now have the proof that it was wrong. Motor traffic is now back to roughly 100% of previous levels, and we've still got 3.4 million people furloughed, and we've still got large proportion of the working population working from home. Now, the government, Peter's pointed out that, and I guess he's right, that the government's decision, UK government's decision to say that it will ban the sale of petrol and diesel cars from 2035, it is, as by their standards, a big step forward, but it's nowhere near enough. We can go into the calculations later, but I'll just show you this one slide that shows you what has been happening in Norway. Now, Norway has been far and away the fastest acting country in the world on electrification, but the lag between the change in sales and the change in the composition of the cars on the road is very great. So electrification by 2035 on its own won't be enough. Now, in my latest book, Roads, Runways and Resistance, I tell the political story behind the most controversial transport issues of the past 30 years. And one of the most significant of those was the campaign against fuel tax, the fuel tax protests in the year 2000. Now, if we look at this logically and rationally, there is a very, very simple solution to this, far more effective than road pricing if we are concerned about reducing carbon rather than congestion, and that's to put up the cost of petrol and diesel. But ever since those protests 21 years ago, politicians have been doing the opposite. And my big concern, and I wrote this recently in Evidence, the Parliamentary Committee, is that the real politics might mean that if we do go down the road of introducing fuel tax, road pricing, that it may be done in such a way that actually makes driving cheaper on uncongested roads, so that the net outcome could be worse than doing nothing. It could actually result in an increase in carbon emissions. So what else can we do faced with all of that? Well, I have to say, I don't know, putting together both the what ought we to do and what will real politics bear, I don't know the answer. But what I can say is that we need radical action. We cannot over rely on one or two measures. So electrification plus road pricing alone is not going to be enough. We do urgently need to reverse those cuts in fuel taxes. And that needs to be kind of presented in a way that's saying, well, look, petrol and diesel is on its way out. We are serious about this. So governments, one way or another, are going to have to bite that bullet if we are to make progress fast enough on this. Then there are a whole bunch of other measures with which I guess a lot of you will be familiar about urbanisation, traffic removal in cities, scrappage schemes. I think some have been given a bad name because, you know, some of them have been presented in a way that essentially just benefits the motor industry and increases the number of vehicles on the roads. But what I mean by scrappage is scrappage schemes that are going to reduce the number of vehicles on the road. Obviously, more ambitious support for walking and cycling. And then a final point, which we may get into in the discussion, and one which is like the elephant in the room, is everyone is assuming that COVID is going to be a temporary thing, that life one way or another will return to normal, and in particular public transport will return to normal. What if it doesn't? What if COVID is now going to be a recurring problem, and or other pandemics in future, and people are permanently dissuaded from using shared forms of transport? What is the plan B in that case? That is a whole other agenda, which I think the transport planning professions urgently need to address.
Steve, thank you. I think we lost sound there, but is that in the conclusion to your talk? I'm seeing the thumbs up. Steve,
oh, sorry, somehow I got muted there. Yeah, sorry. Did you hear about the plan B?
Yes, please. Yeah, if you.
So, did you hear the plan B?
I think we caught the plan B. So, right. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
So that's fine.
Indeed. So I'm glad that you'll be able to join us later with sound for the panel discussion that we'll have. Thank you for kicking us off with some interesting points to talk about. And I think we're going to move on to Trevor's conversation now, and he will cover a little bit more on roads and what we can do in relation to behaviour change there. Thank you, Trevor.
Yes, thank you, Katie, and thank you for inviting me to do this. Yeah, I'm going to talk about behaviour change in terms of road pricing, and you heard Steve talk about the limitations of road pricing, but it's still certainly one of the tools, one of the major tools available. Just a little bit about my background. First, I'm an independent consultant specialising in road user charging. In the UK, I've worked on charging schemes like the London Congestion Charge and Dart Charge. I've worked on clean air projects like the London Low Emission Zone, the London Ultra Low Emission Zone. I've worked with the Joint Air Quality Unit on their clean air zones, and I've worked with 4 of the city councils on their implementations of clean air zones. I also work on a number of overseas projects, and presently I'm the lead technical consultant to the Dutch government on their distance-based national distance-based charging scheme for trucks. Next slide, please. So I think this is ground that's probably been gone over by Peter and by Steve previously, but just these are the sort of real problems faced by governments and by road authorities at the moment. They have demand for good transport. You can argue how much of that should be there. That leads to a number of problems. It leads to congestion, it leads to poor air quality, and it leads to climate change. And the solutions that are proposed for those, particularly in terms of reducing traffic and reducing the number of fuel-driven vehicles in favour of electric-driven vehicles, give governments a number of other problems, which is reducing the take on fuel tax, and that is presently, I believe, about 25 billion per year, and reducing the vehicle tax, because we're now taxing less low emission vehicles, and that's presently about 5 billion a year. And if you set on top of that the sort of generally accepted principles of fairness, which is that the user pays principles, the polluter pays principles, and I think you've heard the previous speakers saying that they probably don't pay enough for those, and the need to encourage modal shift as well as encouraging just purely less demand for transport. Next slide, please. So what I've tried to do in this slide is really to talk about the sort of tools that are available to road authorities in terms of road pricing or in terms of pricing, and try to sort of classify them into ones that are applicable to all roads, ones that are applicable only to cities, and ones that charge per use or have a kind of fixed charge. And I guess in general, you would think that things like user pays and polluter pays tends to push you more towards the charge per use. And if you really want to particularly address carbon, you probably need something that's applicable maybe even beyond cities. Now, you can argue which box these things go into. There's obviously exceptions, but I just wanted to get the general point across. So if we look at the bottom left-hand corner, things like workplace parking levy, congestion charging, and clean air zones and low emission zones, they're very good and potentially effective schemes. They are only applicable to cities, really. You can have congestion charging and clean air zones and things on interurban roads, but in general, the way we're doing them, and it's a fixed charge. If you go into a clean air zone, you pay the same whether you're in there for 2 minutes or whether you actually drive around in it all day. Likewise with the congestion charge. So if we then move more to the bottom right, parking charges, yes, they're progressive. They charge the longer you park, the more you pay. They have a rather strange effect, actually, because when the vehicle's parked, of course, it's not producing pollution and it's not causing congestion, but we charge them more. So there's probably a limit to how much you can use that tool. If you start charging too much, you're probably going to get a negative effect on that. People are going to start getting their partners to drive them in and then come and pick them up. We talk about fixed charge on all roads, road tax, HGV levy. They are a fixed charge. You pay it once per year or once per time. And again, it doesn't matter how much you use the roads. It certainly contravenes the polluter pays and the user pays principle, although you can make more polluting vehicles pay more. So if you look at that favored right-hand top box, you have tools like charging for infrastructure, things like Dart Charge and the Humber Bridge Charge, Mersey Gateway, M6 Expressway. They are pay per use. They're applicable to all potential roads, but are very, very limited in their scope and huge resistance to increasing the number of those. So useful tools, but probably pretty limited. Fuel tax, Steve talked about that just earlier, and I support his view that fuel tax should be increased, but increasing fuel tax may drive that shift towards electric vehicles, but it's not really going to address any of the other problems like the decreasing tax take on fuel, because overall the number of vehicles will be going down and dropping very fast after 2030. Then you come into distance-based charging, and as you'll see probably on the next slide, that really ticks all the boxes. So what I've tried to do on this slide is to look down the side of all the tools and across the top what the problems are and which tools address which problems, if you like. And I'm not going to go through each one line by line. But the size of the tick is generally sort of my idea on how well it addresses the problems. And if you look at it, the only real solution that gives the road authority tools to be able to address all of those problems and is distance-based charging. And I'm just going to spend the next couple of slides just talking a little bit more about distance-based charging and the potential implementation of that. So next slide, please. So what are we talking about with distance-based charging? Well, the most likely technology is through what in the trade is known as global navigation by satellite system. We know it as the most common type, which is GPS, but there are others. There's Galileo and there's the Russian system. And the idea is that you have an onboard unit that records the distance traveled by the vehicle and the location, and that information is then sent through to, probably not to a government, but probably more to a service provider. And they set up accounts for you, you can pay for it, and that money eventually passes through to the road authority. It's incredibly flexible. It gives the toolkit available to the authorities is that the charge can then be varied by the time of day. You know, we're pretty used to paying for trains, more trains during peak time. Why not roads? The place, so you can charge more for the M25 than you charge for more minor roads and less congested roads. Vehicle type and certainly particularly the emissions class. And some people are proposing a step beyond that, and I'm not sure I propose it at the moment, but they have dynamic pricing. So if the pollution levels are high, you actually price the road more. If congestion levels are high, you price that road more. So if you look across Europe, this is becoming the default kind of road user charging system for trucks. There's presently 9 European countries that have distance-based charging, including Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, Hungary, Czech Republic, etc., etc. And there's more coming on board. I'm involved in the proposed new system for the Netherlands. Lithuania's currently got a tender out for a new system. So it's rapidly becoming the default way of charging for trucks, and it's seen as very fair and generally accepted by the trucking industry. Several governments have commissioned studies for all vehicle distance-based charging. I was involved in a study for the Dutch government to look into it. That was sent to the Dutch Parliament, the Tweede Kamer. And Belgium has done one. There's been lots of studies in America and some trials, so very wide-based studies on that. And you know, one of the surprising things that people think about, people think that the technological issues are insurmountable. They are not. It's been proven through truck tolling. The major problems that you have been outlined by the previous speakers. It's the public mindset, which is vehemently anti-tolling, particularly in the UK, but I think that is beginning to change. There's political will, and there's, you know, it needs to be across all parties. There's privacy concerns because you're tracking vehicles, and there is the cost, and those are the big 4 issues around the potential for distance-based charging, particularly for all vehicles. Next slide, please. So if you look at the technology, you know, there are lots of options there. There's lots of options for the onboard equipment. You can have a dedicated onboard equipment, which is what the trucks use presently. It's quite expensive. There's increasing interest in the use of smartphones for it. Everybody has a smartphone, and it has GPS in it, and it has communications, the 2 essential things for tracking it. There's what are called dongles, a wonderful word, to plug into the onboard diagnostics port that every vehicle now has. I think the thing for the future, though, is much more excuse me, is connected vehicles, where you know, vehicles are increasingly connected to the vehicle manufacturer, and they send a great raft of information back to the manufacturer. And their idea is basically that information, which includes positional information, can then be used for tolling purposes. And you know, technology around enforcement is also well established, mainly based around automatic number plate recognition. The truck schemes use a sort of short-range communication system called DSRC to download some information on that. That's not necessary. You can enforce without that, and it makes a huge difference to the cost of implementation. So next slide, please. So just in conclusion, my view is that all vehicle distance-based charging is the most effective way of addressing the kind of problems that authorities have today. It's being considered by many governments. I think there's an increasing acceptance in the UK and in overseas governments that actually it's inevitable. It will happen. It's just a question of when, not if. There are a few alternatives. The technological issues have largely been overcome, as I said, but you do need to address those political wills, and the public acceptability is a huge obstacle, but they are reducing over time. And if you want some further reading, I've given a link there to the report to the Dutch Parliament on all vehicle tolling, all vehicle distance-based tolling. It's called Betalen na gebruik, which is paying by use. It's in Dutch, but machine translations are very good these days. Next slide, please. I think that's the end of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Trevor. And actually, I think we have a couple of polls, do we not, to launch?
We do, yes.
Yes. So we've got a couple of polls here that would just like a quick view from the audience, having heard Trevor's discussion. And we'll open these for a few minutes and then report on these findings later on. So, yeah, I can see the results coming in now. So please do.
Right. Okay. People are already doing it, I think.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah. Just a couple of things just while there's the poll's happening, and I know it's only a few seconds. GPS in cars. It's not widely known that every vehicle at the moment that's sold at the moment has GPS in it for the eCall system. So the technology or existing cars is not used for that purpose, but who knows, could be in the future. And the only other thing I was going to go into was just to discuss. There's a very interesting presentation by Stephen Lederman a couple of years ago. He was the Secretary of State for Transport for the Labour Party when we last tried to introduce national road user charging back in 2005. And he said the surprising thing, or one of the surprising things to him, was the people who didn't back it. And he particularly raised the subject of the Green Party, who came out against national road user charging, even though you think it would be very much in their interest. And the reason was basically they saw it as a vote loser, and that sort of trumped any other considerations.
Well, they were really quick polls, certainly. Thank you, Trevor, for the further comments there. What we'll do, I think, is return to those results when we've heard from the other speakers. We've got Deborah and Mike coming up now to give a slightly different perspective on different aspects of behaviour changes in relation to transport. So, Trevor, thank you very much, and I'll pass straight on to Deborah, if I may.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Katie. So it's a lot to get through in 10 minutes, but what I want to do is just highlight to you some of the journey that the West Midlands is on, including our two organisations, the Combined Authority there and Transport for West Midlands, why we need individual behaviour change and what sort of objectives might gain public support. And then really highlight a couple of innovation projects that are underway currently that will help us to really understand people's behaviour in a real deep way, so that we can identify which carrots or sticks or both we're offering to them, and then possible future considerations for targeting of transport monies. So on the next slide, please. Just a bit of strategic context about the West Midlands, and together we're building a healthier, happier, better connected and more prosperous West Midlands, and there's a whole range of strategy documentation that fits together and runs a golden thread through everything we do, down to from policy through to operations. And my role in demand management is very much about operational interventions and seeking to influence people's travelling behaviour. On the next slide, the evolution to this year is really taking our hashtag WM2041 original plan principles, which were produced in January 2020, through into a very detailed 5-year plan, which we're now entering into. And it's a really interesting and pivotal time for the WMCA. It's engaged the Behavioural Insights team to look at what sort of policy and communications would gain most traction with the West Midlands population, and really delve into some of the behaviours that the West Midlands population shows in order to sort of tap into their motivations. So we're starting to get from, some of the other contributions this morning have been very much about people in general. So I'm just going to start sort of honing in on who those people are. So we have people at a regional scale, but also we have multiple people types, segments and personas within the region itself. So let's come on to the next slide. So you won't be able to see this particularly clearly, but you can refer to the 5-year plan that I've highlighted. But what I really wanted to pick out was the transport actions, and they're really framed around the themes of avoid, shift and improve. So let's come on to my next slide, please. This is about an accelerated scenario to 2041. And I just wanted to remind us, why we need behaviour change. Because fundamentally, marketing and communications alone won't shift people's behaviours long term. And I always like to put the COM-B model in my slides for a presentation like this, just to remind us of the sort of interventions that are needed, both regulatory and fiscal, to help drive those positive behaviours. And it's very clear in the 6th carbon budget that reaching net zero will require people to actively engage with emissions and reduce or adapt their demand for energy intensive services. So we can no longer rely on changes that have just been about reducing the supply of emissions into the economy without putting some sort of behavioural burden on individuals. So if we come on to my next slide, please. So I mentioned the behavioural insights work with the WMCA, and whilst I don't subscribe to the school of thought that behaviour is a science, it is something that you can apply some methodologies and tools to. And so here is the theory of change, taking people from a lack of belief in climate change into a belief in the importance of it, and then an engagement with climate change communications and supporting net zero policies. And then the real behaviour change itself, so just reinforcing that marketing and communications alone or information alone isn't going to fundamentally drive those changes in behaviour. And I often refer to the UCL study that put I think the length of time it takes to establish behaviour is about 66 days. So a lot of the short-term initiatives that we're funded to deliver in the public sector certainly will need to go further and longer than, say, a few months or even a year of grant budgets to have a real traction with a substantial amount of people as we're looking for. So on my next slide, please. Again, it is perhaps a little bit small for some of you to see, but I really wanted to focus on framing for environmental issues. So this is often used as a guide to the sort of frames that would have a really positive, a high effectiveness rate. And so we're looking in the West Midlands Combined Authority at messaging around public health that addresses public health concerns, that has a kind of a moral, ethical argument, and is about gain messages positively framed. Some people favour that sort of loss type messaging, where you're losing something, but it can provoke feelings of anxiety and fear. So we're focusing very much on the gain messaging. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So yeah, so I wanted to highlight a couple of innovation projects that are really going to translate some of these high-level ambitions into operations. And the Future Transport Zone is a £22 million project. It very much has behaviour at its heart. We really need to understand behaviour around transport and to be able to target transport interventions. And one of the showcases going on at the moment is with the University of Warwick, looking at a range of mobility solutions and the uptake of those solutions and how they're put into practice by people. It's very ethnographic, very much about sort of understanding how people react. There's also mobility credits, and there's also mobility as a service. So there's a whole range of interventions going on there and some really deep learning as a result. On the next slide, I wanted to highlight a project that I'm deeply involved with, and that's the Network Resilience Live Lab. Very much an operational project, about 2.65 million over a couple of years. And this is helping to improve the capability of our relatively new Regional Transport Coordination Centre in the West Midlands through innovation. And we're combining data analytics from multiple sources, so we group them together as static automated traffic counters and really get a deeper understanding of customers and who uses the road network. So big projects, but how are we actually putting that into practice? So getting really deeply under the skin of who is travelling in the West Midlands. On my next slide, we can start to look at that in a bit more detail and how we're spatially mapping some of our travelling public. So taking a really deep piece of segmentation undertaken in the Future Transport Zone, and then combining it with granular personas developed with the Live Lab monies, we've come up with a really exciting and novel package of ways to identify our travelling public, where they live, what their motivations are and preferences and so on. So I wanted to give you an example of how we could put this into practice, because it all sounds great in theory. So I've taken 2 existing West Midlands transport schemes. So we can't retrofit new techniques, new behavioural insights onto these, but we can use them and apply them, and just see whether we made the right decision when those schemes were conceived. So I suppose my first future consideration for targeting of transport monies is to seek out where there's the highest propensity for people to change their behaviour spatially using segmentation and traveller personas. What you're looking at here is a snip from our Tableau all traveller segmentation, and it's been put through a dashboard called our pinch point dashboard that can show you here a scheme going up the Fosel Road in Coventry in the Active Travel Fund. What we can see here is that people in this area, generally speaking from the personas perspective, are striving to get ahead. So, this is good news for us, because people striving to get ahead, our research tells us, are more likely to consider travel behaviour change, and they're also less likely to already own a car. And in this instance, we're seeking to change their behaviour to active travel. So on the next slide, please. We can just understand Liam a bit better now. Liam is a real person. It's one of the 48 people that took part in our personas research. They were picked as the sort of absolute nub of those segments that I described earlier. So Liam is a real person, but we've changed his photograph to protect his identity. And as I mentioned, you know, Liam needs a range of things to enable him to conduct active travel. But by doing this sort of deep level of research, we can really understand what his motivations are and what his barriers are to change and what we might need to do differently. And I think I'm conscious of time, so I can't go on too much longer. But I think the real exciting thing for me is that Liam's persona is about his whole life. It's not about whether he has a bicycle, and it's not about whether he uses a bus one day a week. It's about his real life and his intermodal journeys, and that's what we really need to focus on, rather than modal specialisms and focusing on shiny transport product. So if we go on to the next slide, please. This is another one of my concepts about how we might target transport investment in the future. So let's conceive of a time where we're using propensity for people to change their travel behaviour to influence whether we need a transport scheme at all. Transport schemes are costly, they take a long time to implement, they cause a lot of disruption, and they use a range of materials that go against the principles of decarbonisation in a lot of cases. So I started to look at this in the context of a scheme we have in the metro extension up to Edgbaston. I'm certainly not advocating in this discussion that we might not have had that scheme. It's a fantastic scheme that will really connect communities. However, what I can do is show you just a bit of evaluation from our demand management activities in 2019. So the closure of Five Ways Underpass was heralded by the local press as a potential Carmageddon. The journalists were actually camping out on this junction when the underpass was closed. However, what we found by doing advanced communications and demand management, there was a 4% shift in travel mode to walking and rail, helping to reduce traffic on the road network. We had quite a decent amount of capacity available on our walking routes, on our cycling routes, and also to a certain extent on our rail network outside of peak commuter times. So there was lots of capacity there that could have taken that travelling public who were, we found, able to change their travel behaviours. And also they responded really well to the messaging. And I would call that a gain message there, going back to some of the sort of theory before. So if you're stuck in delays today, if you plan ahead, you'll have a better journey tomorrow. So, you know, ultimately, could we in the future, when we're considering transport schemes and the cost benefit of them, could we consider if traffic demand was managed better in different ways to remove journeys and remode them, especially, could we avoid that scheme altogether? And I think organisations like Highways England, and I'm sure academics have taken this concept a lot further than I can today. But those are my two concepts for delivering transport projects in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Deborah. It's really good to see a local authority perspective on this, or combined authority, and what you've been doing in terms of data-driven insights as well, which I think is really valuable. I am also conscious of time. I want to leave some time for the panel discussion, but thank you very much for your contributions now. I'll invite you back shortly. I'm just going to invite Mike Scott from SYSTRA to just add a few concluding thoughts on some of the topics that we've heard, and then we'll go straight into a panel discussion with those that have been speaking over the last half an hour or so. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Katie. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I just want to say there's been some superb presentations, and as the person going last, it's my job to repeat some of them, so apologies for that, but also add some thoughts in readiness for the panel discussion. I'm not quite that quick, whoever's clicking the yes, next slide, please. So yeah, briefly on carrots, and I see that there's been some questions about this already in terms of investment to encourage new different modal choices. It's been a policy in transport for many years. It's been a policy, but it's actually largely been forgotten in terms of investment during many of those years. We continue to see some great intentions. There's some of the most recent documents there on the slide, but the key really is, you know, and some of those documents contemplate taking road space off motor vehicles, giving them to cycles, taking some more road space off motor vehicles, giving that to buses. Some of that, I suppose, would be the conclusion you draw, but it has to all be made to happen, and clearly support for capital and revenue costs is critical there. But actually, there's a point here: are those carrots enough to drive sufficient to drive enough change in transport behaviour? Next slide, please. So you know, perhaps I think the conclusion from this morning so far: real change in transport behaviour requires us to wield the stick as well as dangle the carrot, particularly as more infrastructure tends to increase miles travelled, which of course has a retrograde impact on carbon emissions and other emissions rather than a beneficial one. It's great to see that in Wales, at least, that's being latched onto. It's been mentioned in the chat, I see. That some kind of moratorium on road building has been put in place, not before time, if you want my personal view. So how can we change the transport offer through implementing sticks? There's really two ways. We can prevent things with closures, bans, I'll come onto this in a minute, or we can dissuade, and we've heard quite a lot about using price and various other matters to dissuade through price to dissuade polluting transport habits. But herein lies the challenge. We typically ban things that are bad for us. In my great contemporary way, I'm going to remind you about the film With Nail and I. Richard E. Grant in that film, dreadful, wasn't it? The booze, the fags, the drugs, oh, dreadful. But we love the old Jag that he drove around, didn't we? And really, to me, that encapsulates the problem. We tend to tax things that are bad for us. Do we perceive that our cars yet are bad for us in enough numbers? Next slide, please. So I'll quickly go through that. We've heard about this before, but bans to, banning things to reduce emissions. Well, we can do it at a local level through pedestrianising streets, through putting nice, attractive yellow buses, as you can see, up and down Grey Street in Newcastle, converting highways, cycleways and busways, as is the current now policy of this government. We can do it at city level as well through a sort of a greater geography of road closures, but these things have consequences. Keen students among you will notice that's not a list of popular things that I've put on there, certainly in some of our towns and cities. And of course, these closures and bans, they create edge effects. We see that even in charging schemes, particularly in closure schemes. We see edge effects, not always, but sometimes we do, places where actually around the edge of our zones emissions worsen. And of course, the actual actions of these might not change mode or travel behaviour. It might just change where people go to. They'll sack it off and go somewhere else. And whether that really benefits us is open to question. Next slide, please. So we've heard about pricing through parking charges, through tolling points. We can do these things at a city level through workplace parking levies by the road user charging type of schemes that we've heard from Trevor. And we can do things at a national level. We can jack up vehicle excise duty. We can jack up taxes on fossil fuels, and we can look at a national roads charging scheme as we've had discussed already. Last slide, please. But this is a tricky prospectus, and it's something that I think we can hopefully focus on in the panel discussion to follow. There are some real equity issues. City scale charging, I think it was alluded to before, can have a disproportionate effect on people who, at the moment, at least, rely on a car but have a lower income. That's a disproportionate effect. So we really need to get the alternatives in place before we affect those people too much, and that is a challenge that we face of capital and revenue funding at the moment. Some of these issues impact on our retail and commercial activity in our towns and cities. I mean, do we really think that the economy of our towns and cities trumps the environment? I mean, that's a question, and that really is the key question, I think, around this debate at the moment. And of course, if we go for very blunt instruments like doubling vehicle excise duty or whatever it might be, that has effect in rural areas where perhaps air quality issues are less of an issue, and urban areas alike, and whether that's fair. We've talked about national road user charging. Economists love it. Technologists will probably think, yeah, that's fantastic. Transport planners and traffic engineers like me might think it's quite a headache. Are these challenges surmountable? Well, we've heard that there's work going on to really take on that challenge at the moment. So that's great to hear. And then, of course, there's politics, particularly local politics of people who have lived their lives in the car age, and getting through that. I have no real opinion other than to say getting through that is a tricky prospectus, to take the words of the title of this last slide. So does the answer lie in a national strategy that contemplates, actually, rather than one solution, a toolkit of solutions with the legislation to back them up? I think that's a moment or a statement to leave you with, and hopefully start what looks like a good panel discussion. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Mike. Certainly appreciate your brevity on that one, and for trying to draw together threads of some very interesting discussion so far. So if I could invite the rest of the speakers back to join us for this panel discussion. We have until about 11:15 this morning to just talk through some of the issues that have been raised. So if there are other questions that you have for the panel, do put them to us now, but we've certainly got a lot. Steve, Deborah, I hope you're also joining us, appearing from the ether. Steve, are you there with us as well? We may have lost him.
No, I'm here.
No, fantastic. In which case, I'd actually like to start with you, Steve, if I may, because I don't know if everybody did hear your sort of last couple of points you were making at the end of your presentation. We were discussing the potential for a plan B. I wonder if you might just reiterate a little bit of what you were saying at the end of that there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more asking the question than answering it. I mean, I have wrote about this for Local Transport Today a while back, and gave a kind of an illustration of the types of things that might involve. I mean, I think that if pandemic, social distancing, aversion to shared transport, if they do become a permanent feature of life from now on, then I think we would have to reconsider the entirety of the transport system, both private and public. And we might want to then be looking at actually effectively abolishing the difference between the two. So at its most sort of radical, it might mean individual pods which sort of join together to do longer distance travel. I mean, I think I don't necessarily promote that as the answer, but what I'm saying is that if that is the case, then everything that we've all been working on and planning up until now effectively will have to go out the window, and we will be starting from a blank sheet of paper. And that may be why nobody even wants to talk about it.
Is there anyone else on the panel that would like to talk about it and offer a view on that at this stage? It's a tricky question to start off with. Well, maybe we shall return to that in as the conversation develops a little bit then, because actually maybe it's worth dealing with a couple of the specific points that we had on the road user charging, not least also looking at the answers to the poll. So we posed a few questions for you at the end of Trevor's talk, and I'm just putting up, hopefully you can all see the results of that now. So Trevor, I mean, I've got a couple of questions for you as well, but whether you've got any comment to make on the findings of that poll.
Yeah,
it's the equity is an important issue.
Yeah, so you know, I'm sort of encouraged by the Yes for All Drivers item there, and you know, people are obviously interested in the kind of tools that might be available to road authorities by time, by location, by vehicle type. I'm kind of a bit surprised that the location one is so low, because you know, it seems entirely logical that you would pay more to drive on, you know, some roads than other roads, and I can't see why people would go away from that. Having said that, if you look at the truck tolling schemes in Europe, which are the model, if you like, most of them have shied away from charging differentially by roads. They just charge per kilometre, and I guess there must be a sort of it adds complexity, and you know, it's more difficult to explain, but the benefits are very clear, I would have thought.
We also had a couple of conversations, they're coming up now on the screen. Hopefully you can see both of these, the polls on the city and regional ones particularly. So not an overwhelming majority on city-based charges.
Yeah, so yeah, people are obviously more interested in city. And you know, if you look at the division between city, you know, if you're interested in reducing pollution and improving air quality, you obviously concentrate on cities. You know, they're the hotspots, if you like. But if you're looking at climate change, you know, that's CO2, and you probably need to look much wider.
Yeah, and here's some specifics on the view on what type of charging people might favour.
So yeah, there's sort of vote for the London congestion charging type view, and you know, even London are thinking actually that actually the sort of cordon type you know, access charge type scheme is maybe not the best, just because it's not progressive. You know, you get charged the same whether you just drive in there for a couple of minutes or whether you drive around in there all day. And obviously there's a huge difference in the amount of pollution, the amount of climate change, the amount of congestion that you cause with that. And London are looking at you know, maybe some sort of distance-based scheme. But to be honest, distance-based schemes just for one city are not really very practical, because it's just too difficult to get the you know, if you're going to have in-vehicle units, it's just too difficult and too expensive to do that just for a city. You'd have to then look at things like you know, trying to put up multiple detection points around the city, and you very quickly come to the conclusion that it's just so expensive and so difficult that it becomes you know, probably a non-starter. Parking charges, not that popular, I guess. Workplace charging levy, and that's probably an underutilized tool at the moment. But again, you know, it has limited to cities and limited to those that are you know, those working journeys. Yeah, more user charging for clean air zones, and you know, clean air zones are undoubtedly a great tool. They would be even better if they actually sort of more closely reflected the use of those zones. But you know, that we should be very pleased that that's been the largest, you know, and will continue to be the largest kind of scheme and policy for a changing behaviour that's probably being through pricing that's being done in the UK today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's quite an interesting way of looking at different aspects of it. I'm surprised that the clean air zones didn't maybe gather more traction there. So, any other comments?
A few words about the case against. I don't have got time.
Yeah.
I mean, I respect for what Trevor says, and clearly he's really knows his stuff on road pricing. The problem is that we can have these sorts of discussions, you know, very, very rational, very calm, assuming that, you know, the world works according to rational principles. But my big fear about this is that what would happen if road pricing was introduced in the real world is that the politics of it would mean that what would happen is that there would be an element of a revenue neutral element. In order to sell it to motorists, you would end up with a situation where it makes it more expensive to drive on congested roads where there's little potential for more traffic anyway, and it would make it cheaper to drive on uncongested roads, rural roads, etc., where there's plenty of extra capacity for more traffic. And what you end up with is a higher mileage overall, higher emissions, and higher contribution to climate change. I mean, if we think that climate change is the most important issue, why would we not tackle it at source, which is the use of fossil fuels?
And I think that's a real, you know, that is a real concern, Steve. And you know, if you look at the clean air zones, one of the things that comes out of it is the consultation that's been on exemptions. And you know, the problem with any change, you know, any change in the way things are charged for, is that there's winners and losers, and the winners all stay quiet, and the losers all go on national TV and you know, lobby their politicians and all the rest of it, exactly the way that you've described it. And so what you're saying, you know, I guess I'm a technologist and I'm saying, here's all the tools, politicians, up to you how to use it. You know, how they use it then is up to them. And you're right that you know, there are discussions on average being revenue neutral and all of this. And pricing is imperfect. You know, it favors the rich, it doesn't favor the poor, and that, you know, so that, you know, it should be seen in that context. But nevertheless, you know, the alternatives are not really there. You know, it's you need to do something, and it takes a bit of political courage to not be influenced by all the sort of naysayers and all the people that are saying, oh, this is too difficult, and really go for a pricing mechanism that really will change behaviour.
That's right. And I mean, I was just going to say that, you know, there are other types of pricing as well as road pricing and clean air zones, and one of those is parking pricing. And, you know, ideally in the transport market, the prices travellers pay should cover all the costs of their travel, so they shouldn't be significant unaccounted external costs of their travel, whether they be carbon emissions or road wear and so on. So we know fundamentally that people aren't paying the full price of the cost of their travel, and that has to be heavily subsidised. But yeah, so just wanted to mention that there are a range of types of fiscal disincentives, but also we'll need to really support those on lower incomes to adapt during transition. So, you know, whether that's developing public infrastructure to accommodate the change in consumer prices, choices, or you know, helping the industry to actually meet the demand. I mean, one of the ironic things I think last year was that the bicycle industry found it very difficult to adapt to the sudden rise in demand for bicycles. You know, I think we need to be ready for this mass shift in choices in demand, if we're going to actually really capitalise on all our plans and ambitions.
That's a good point. I would like to come on, Mike, if you had something to add there.
Just a very quick one, Katie. It follows on from what Deborah was saying there about the use of parking charges. I mean, we quite a few of us are engaged in a lot of this national bus strategy work at the moment, and the bus industry, particularly the trade bodies, have two mantras. One is provide more road space to buses, dedicated to buses, which is a perfectly logical way of going about things. But the other one is jack up city centre parking charges as a way of getting more people on buses. And I just have a feeling that I'm not entirely sure they're exactly the same markets, people who are parking in city centres and who are riding buses. And in any case, the idea that double the parking prices and people will automatically just switch to the bus, I think there's a lot more choices that people will in their Rolodex of transport choices in their minds will go through as motorists before they get to jumping on the bus. So it's not illogical, I'm not saying that, but there's a lot of work alongside jacking up parking charges to make that behaviour change really stick.
Thanks, Mike. And Trevor, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, just a final, just supporting what Deborah's saying, really, on, you know, I think the Birmingham Clean Air Zone is maybe a model for helping people on lower incomes kind of cope with these things. You know, there's a transitional scheme to help people on low incomes in Birmingham to, you know, they have a discount or an exemption from the charge. It's got a sunset period on it, but it, you know, it helps them make that transition.
Yes, the conversation about equity has come up quite a bit in the topics that we've heard in terms of how do we ensure that these are not disproportionately affecting certain groups of society, and indeed it's sort of related to that. Is there a sort of a danger that those are the ones that are most likely to change their behaviour are the ones that are least likely to benefit from the change? Is there sort of how do we deal with the issue of equity in some of these issues?
Oh, that's an interesting point, because when we look at the West Midlands granular personas, it's actually those with the highest level of affluence that are least prepared to change travel behaviour. But you could argue quite easily that in terms of decarbonisation and climate change, those are the ones most likely to make a more significant difference to those that perhaps don't own a vehicle already. So we have quite a high level of ownership of vehicles in the West Midlands area, and from our surveys, it's clear, you know, many households have over 2 vehicles on their forecourts, and so it is, I think, a dilemma really when choosing the right persona and the right segment to target with your behaviour change initiatives.
And have others got other examples of where we've looked at equity or just transition in terms of how this affects different types of or segments of society?
I alluded to it in one of my slides. I probably skated past it quite quickly, but it clearly is a real issue here. That you know, using price as a dissuasion, or even actually using just bans and prevention as a means of persuading different transport choices can have disproportionate effects. You know, we want people to be socially mobile. We want, I think we want people to, you know, have access to better jobs and training and this, that, and the other. The thinking through the effects of some of these behaviour changes on that needs to be done. It's not to say, as I said before, it's not to say that economic and you know, those kind of influences should trump the environment. We're clearly not in that world, but we definitely need to factor them into the thinking and make sure we minimise as far as possible those particular sort of sector effects within the population.
And we talked about the importance of having suitable and attractive alternatives available to people and having that infrastructure in place. I mean, obviously we've seen the building back better in terms of buses, and also Great British Railways, the reinvigoration of public transport as an offer. Mike, maybe you've got a view on how far that's going to go in terms of encouraging public transport use. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's fabulous to see the noisy truck. Apologies. It's fabulous to see the scale of ambition. Certainly, that the buses and the active travel documents, they're the ones I'm most, you know, au fait with. The Great British Railways one. There are other experts who can probably tell you more about that. But it's great to see the ambition in those, and it needs to be backed by the funding. Is the issue. Now, we have a particularly unique way of configuring our transport system in this country that makes that sometimes quite difficult, and I'm not proposing that it changes, but we just need to factor that into the thinking. Yeah, the ambition is there, the challenge there has been set by, let's have it right, by number 10 as much as by the DFT, but a lot of the solutions, certainly in the short and medium term, lie in cold hard cash, I'm afraid, and that's a particular issue in this, you know, just out of austerity, coming out of COVID-19 world that we live in.
Any other views from the panel on that subject?
I think that we have to, broadly speaking, view the providing alternatives, the improvements in that way that Mike has just said. There's often been a kind of a naive view in the past that, and it still gets written into all kinds of policy documents, and that if we improve public transport, improve conditions for walking and cycling, that will somehow reduce emissions, reduce congestion, etc. The evidence for that is extremely weak, and that's not the reason for doing it. The reason why we need to do it is because if we are serious about reducing car use, then people have a right to expect that we will provide better alternatives. I think we need to look at it that way around.
And touching on your point about the evidence base as well, I think that's something that we perhaps also should be looking at in terms of, you know, as you say, the evidence base might be weak and in some cases just doesn't exist. And I think for business case and funding appraisal of schemes, do we need to be looking differently at how we value carbon, how we appraise schemes to be sort of getting us to in the right direction? Deborah, have you had any experience in terms of funding bids and appraisal in that sense?
Not so much capital schemes. I do think there's going to be a huge challenge to decarbonise the supply chain of our capital transport schemes, and so I suppose my pitch today was about that scheme avoidance, if you like. But you know, where a scheme is taking place, all of that embedded carbon material, the whole range of materials, I think is a real opportunity for the supply chain to respond and bring forward new ideas to help make it possible. But I don't personally have a direct experience of that.
Katie, Katie, you're trying to provoke me into my web tag run. And I'm not going there.
I don't want to hear the full web tag round today. Thanks.
But it goes back to what we prioritise going forward, because our current appraisal and evaluation methodologies clearly prioritise time and money ahead of the environment. And if we want to drive real change in transport, that fundamental has to change in the same way. You know, we're nudging so slowly towards that. Something has to accelerate. It's hard, but it has to be done.
And I would add to that.
Sorry. Deb, sorry, come in, and then Steve. Yeah.
Well, I would just add to that. Within the current funding regime, so much focus is placed on capital investment, and you really have to make a very, very compelling case for a very, you know, even a modest, say, a 5 or 10% revenue contribution to activating behaviour change around transport schemes. And this is something we're getting very good at in Transport for West Midlands, but it's an uphill struggle. So for programmes such as our travel programme, we've been allocated £17 million worth of capital to create some fantastic schemes, all our blue lanes, segregated lanes, low traffic neighbourhoods and so on. But we had to work really hard to put together a package of behavioural change measures. Those things just don't come out of thin air. They are things that have to be costed. We go through our frameworks and, you know, appoint those experts able to deliver them. And so they do come at a cost, and that there's not enough emphasis on those, or not enough balance between the building of capital infrastructure and the revenue to activate it.
Steve, sorry, you wanted to add something as well.
Yeah, I was going to say fundamentally, I mean, I can't remember who it was who first wrote that cost benefit analysis is nonsense on stilts, right? I think that's where we're going to start, right? I mean, it's probably a whole other debate, but if you actually drill down as to what cost benefit analysis really does, and I teach this on our postgraduate master's course, it's complete nonsense. So, you know, in a logical, rational world, we would simply do away with that. Now, I understand that there's a problem at the moment. Local authorities are forced to use this ludicrous system, which is imposed on them by essentially by the Treasury in England. Though, interestingly, Wales has now introduced a much wider range of possibilities. And so you don't actually have to use cost benefit analysis there. And the problem that we've found doing a bit of research there is that because they're so reliant on consultants who come from England and all they know is really how to do cost benefit analysis, they're still doing the old stuff. So I think it would be very useful to see people working in Wales using some of those new freedoms to show us how you should properly do the appraisal of transport schemes.
Yeah, I think their focus on well-being and the broader sort of drive there, but that's very much political will as well. I mean, how do you get the central government to sort of take on these new, or maybe in some cases slightly controversial approaches if we need to be doing this now? What's our role in an industry, I suppose, in terms of lobbying or being able to support that? Any you know, idea how that's been successful in Wales, how we've managed to achieve that?
I was going to say, you know, with some of the innovation projects underway in Transport for West Midlands currently and funded by government, we do have that opportunity to take learning back. And certainly in our Network Resilience Live Lab, we're looking at near real-time traffic management, near real-time modelling of the networks as a system. It is difficult because if you want to go to real time, you're talking about kind of sort of exponential cost to actually make that real time. But it does take us away from that sort of you know, retrospective modelling using data that may have been generated in 2013 or 2018 even, you know, into current circumstances. So I think that will provoke an evolution in cost benefit analysis, but we're still deep in that research at the moment, and so we don't have all the answers yet.
Yeah, I agree. Mike, and I'm conscious of time as well, so I think if I can ask for concluding comments from everyone. Mike, I'll start with you if you had something to add.
Well, I'll just be quick on that, Katie. I mean, I seriously doubt that many transport ministers are too wedded to COBA and TUBA and all the other cost benefit bits and pieces that we talk about. It requires the experts, the civil servants, I guess, to really drive that through. I think that's how change will be stimulated. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thanks, Mike. And Steve, any last comments from you on that topic, or more generally on what we've been discussing today?
Yeah, I think more generally the big picture is this is really serious. You know, if you're not really worried about climate change at the moment, then clearly you don't know enough about what's actually going on. I'd recommend everybody to look at what's just coming out from the IPCC at the moment. We're not acting fast enough. Those authorities that have declared emergencies are not behaving as if it really was an emergency, and that's the biggest thing. There was one point I realised I forgot to actually talk about in my slides, which is this: we've got to stop making the problem worse. So the two most important things which we need to do right now is stop building roads and stop expanding airports.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, certainly with Wales again showing the way in terms of no new road building there. Trevor, any last comments from you?
Yeah, I guess, you know, the message I tried to get across was there are tools there, the technology is there. You know, those are not the barriers. It's the political will that is the single biggest thing. And, you know, there's always mixed objectives in the politics. You talk about Wales. Actually, Wales is very much in favour of getting rid of the charges on the Severn crossing. That succeeded just before an election, surprisingly enough. And the net result has been that lots of people in Bristol are now living the other side of the Severn crossing, commuting further, causing more pollution. There's more congestion on the M4 and so on. So you need to have political will in the right direction, and you need to have a consensus, because actually a lot of these measures are very unpopular. So you need to have a consensus across the main political parties.
And Deborah, any final comments from you?
Yeah, really, because our theme was behaviour change today, really just to hone in on whose behaviour you want to change. Look at that spatially to see whether it's likely or feasible, and really talk to that person or group of people to really understand their motivations. So that's really how we're going to get that level of change, if we really speak to people in a way that will change their behaviour.
Thank you, and thank you all for very different perspectives and different angles. I think it's given us pause for thought on quite a few topics, and potentially some topics that will need further discussion in future seminars. And we do have another 3 of those coming up in advance of COP26, so another one in about a month's time. Look out for further details on that. But I'd want to just thank all of the panelists again today, and Professor Peter Newell as well for his earlier presentation, and thank you everybody for all of your questions as well. Apologies if we didn't get to them, but certainly we will review that, and I'd encourage you to look at some of the material that our panelists have pointed out today as well. So I will let you all enjoy the rest of your days, but thank you very much everybody for your contributions, and good morning.